Shaun Haney here with Real Agriculture and Real Ag Radio. We're at FarmTech 2019, and right now we are joined by Dr. Brian Beres of AAFC Lethbridge. It's like, like my neighbor.
Just about, yeah. I grew up on a farm southeast of Lethbridge in Ready-Made.
Nice.
Had lots of friends in Picture Butte.
Yeah.
I seem to recall bumping into you a few times.
Yes. So, Brian, where is the most of your research focused?
So, what I typically focus on is developing cropping systems that usually involve either a wheat-based or canola-based cropping system, but, you know, with a real emphasis on systems and how do we best integrate that wheat phase or that canola phase into, you know, some type of a system that maintains all those proxies that we like for sustainability, but it also is profitable for the farmer. Are
you concerned about rotations in Western Canada being too tight?
Well, I think there's always going to be that age-old, you know, challenge at the farm gate of like, how do we maintain profitability, but also, you know, give ourselves a chance to be stewards of the land long enough to pass it on generation to generation, and that whether that's an issue with tight rotations or an issue with trying to manage, you know, newly emerging issues such as weed resistance and how do you manage things like that in a system of no-till without pulling that out again.
And is it fair that we don't want to tillage, we don't want to start doing that like crazy?
You know, to my surprise, you know, it's something that's being talked about more often than not in certain circles because of one, weed resistance, you know, but also, you know, when fusarium's rearing up, it's okay, how can we best destroy the crop residue fast enough so it doesn't colonize? Okay, but
I came up here on Sunday. The wind is howling. And in the vehicle, we're driving by Barron's, and I actually said to Jay, producer Jay, I said to him in the vehicle, just think back to the 30s, 40s, like when we were tilling everything. Just think about how much land would be blowing in a wind like this.
It's amazing, and it's too bad you can't, you know, put our practices in a time capsule and take them back to the 30s, but because I think some of the challenge we've had and what no-till's done to prevent it were in some ways more severe back then. And if they had only had those kind of technologies, it would have been interesting to see how better it would have been managed. And for those farmers from that generation, right, if they only had those tools, because the suffering that came with those practices and the devastation that followed is incomprehensible to us spoiled brats of the 21st century.
It would be super interesting to have that Back to the Future DeLorean and bring them into the future to say, hey, look, and I think their minds would be blown about how not having to recreational till.
Well, I remember my granddad in Fort McLeod when I was a kid. He didn't use a tractor. He used this old Caterpillar that he pulled like about an 8-foot wide cultivator, and he'd be out there all day with the cabs open, and he'd look like a coal miner by the time he came back at the end of the day.
Farmer lung.
Yeah, farmer lung. No kidding.
So you're on a panel here talking about fusarium.
Right.
It's really one of the big threats for the wheat crop. It really, really frustrates growers. When we talk about, you know, the future of breeding, a lot of growers jump to, when is that fusarium-resistant line going to be here? Fusarium is a big challenge.
It is, and it's one of those things where, and we talk about this a lot, but the magic bullet thing just doesn't exist with it. It's something, though, that when you talk about this principle as an agronomist that we talk about of genotype by environment by manage, so this G by E by M, that synergy, there's opportunity there if you manage things right, not to eliminate the problem, but you can certainly do things that if you optimize G by E by M, you're going to be further ahead than someone that doesn't, that's for sure. And it all starts with that genetic component. There hasn't been as much progress. I mean, look at Durham. We're still at best an MS for resistance, you know. But we're making headway in other classes, like winter wheat has an R, right? Some of the other ones are MR. And so how do you take that variety, integrate it with components on the agronomy side so that you've optimized yourself best as possible to disrupt that cropping system and that rotational phase from the life cycle of the fusarium.
Has that disease surprised us at all? Because I remember when it was first starting to be found in Alberta, and of course we had this whole battle about Alberta was going to make sure it didn't have fusarium, as if fusarium was like a rat that we were going to keep out of the province. I heard a lot about how our nights are too cold. We're too close to the mountains in southern Alberta. We're not going to have it, and we found out that was completely incorrect.
Yeah, it's not a new pest. It's been around as long as wheat has, and it probably started with grasses before that. So it's just something that, you have to take the good with the bad. When Fusarium rears its ugly head, when is it? It's when we have conditions that are like extremely productive. Right? You've got really high yield potential. But if you haven't planned right, if you haven't, thought through it thoroughly enough and didn't quite, pick the right tools from your toolbox in anticipation of also having a Fusarium threat, then, there's some pretty bad consequences that can follow.
So it's not just about having that silver bullet like you talked about that's really escaped us up until this point. It's not about just having that variety that's resistant. It's about having this whole toolbox of things you can do to minimize the impact. Maybe not eradicate it, but give yourself a chance to lower the impact. Is that really the best?
Yeah, and I think it's not something where you've got to have like, okay, over in my garage in this corner is the Fusarium toolbox, and over here is the wheat stem sulfide toolbox. It's like there's principles that overlap and overarch. So, for example, when it comes to how do I fully optimize my crop from an agronomic side when it comes to wheat? Well, it's overarching principles. So we want uniformity, starting with that. So we want uniformity, and how do we achieve that? Well, we achieve that with high seeding rates, as a starting point. And so what does that give us? Well, that gives us a really nice uniform canopy, gives us earlier harvests, perhaps shorter flowering periods, and all those things. Just that one step, the one step with seeding rates, all of a sudden now you've actually started to disrupt that cycle a little bit. And so how many other things can you roll on top of that to be even more uniform? Well, we know from the research we did with seed treatments, with a combination of a neonic and a fungicide, it's not to control a soil-borne pathogen or insect pest. What that does is it changes the metabolic pathways in the plant, and all of a sudden you have this vigorously growing plant that is now uniform. It's way more resistant to abiotic stress, and the stronger and healthier that system becomes, the more difficult we've made it for that Fusarium pest to really thrive.
Now, people got really concerned when corn acres started to go up in parts of Western Canada that was going to really throw our Fusarium infection levels higher. Has that been the result?
Is corn a host? You
Absolutely.
Bet it is, right?
Yeah.
And so, and it becomes really difficult to plan for that, because in the panel, like I had a little question for the audience is like, how many phases of a rotation of this friend of mine in Oyen, Alberta, were actually a non-host for Fusarium? And you have things like mustard, followed by durum, followed by chem fallow, followed by peas. You think, well, that's a pretty rock solid one, because we say at least 1 in 2 years you want to be free of a host or have a non-grass, which he does. But the fact is, for harboring Fusarium, the only one that really will do it is mustard. Obviously, the durum harbors it. Chem fallow harbors it, because the way we do it with glyphosate is that we now have freestanding weeds, volunteers, whatever, and that's what Fusarium needs. It needs undisturbed residue, and it thrives there. Even, the perfect storm is if you have that field of peas where it had volunteer or even itself, like you can have low levels of Fusarium colonized there, where my friend Landon thought he had a 1 in 3 or 1 in 4.
Right.
He had a 3 in 4, that particular, and that's why I had no Fusarium, and all of a sudden 2016, whammo. And so it's there's no magic bullet. It's just these little tiny incremental things that you sort of might be a bit, dismissive of. But if you don't think about it and make sure it's right, that, the perfect storm comes.
Hey, this has been a great chat. Wheat Pete is always trying to improve my agronomy all the time. He's always giving me a hard time. You got a great shirt. Let's see your shirt.
So this is in celebration of my inaugural interview in front of the camera, and by you, I thought I'd present you with this T-shirt. to emphasize the agronomy.
Without agronomy, you'd be naked, hungry, and sober.
So there you go, Shaun.
I appreciate it, Brian. That's Brian Beres from AAFC in Lethbridge.